This research journey began one evening in my home here in New Zealand. This is my house at the time and my son in his school uniform. On this particular evening, I'd invited the missionaries from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from our local branch. I'd invited them over to eat dinner with us. And one of the missionaries was a sister from a remote village in Fiji. Over dinner, we were talking about table manners, and this sister happened to mention that in her house, part of having good manners was that the dad and the brothers ate first, and the mom and the sisters ate whatever was left over. And because I was interested, I wrote down her exact quote. She said, "I have 4 sisters and 3 brothers. My brothers are good at eating. I wished there to be enough." Talking with the sister about the gender-based rules and traditions in her culture made me wonder how the gendered practices of the church were interpreted in a place like her LDS home and her LDS ward. So I designed this research project to understand this question better. I decided to use Fiji as a case study to illuminate a broader understanding of the area known as the Global South. The demographic shift in Christianity and Mormonism from the global north to the global south is by now common knowledge. Academics like me are not interested in the global south because it's an exotic travel destination, but because the global south's influence on world religions in general, and our church in particular, is growing. The influence of the global south is poised to expand dramatically in the near future, the coming decades. So how do church members in the global south interpret the gendered practices of the LDS Church? To narrow down this question, I used the following methodology. I designed a research project using semi-structured interviews. I gave 26 interviews total, 10 of them in Fiji. The interviews were on average 75 minutes long. I chose locations around the temples. So in Fiji, I was working in Suva. In New Zealand, I was working in Temple View, Hamilton. And in the US, I was working in Utah Valley, Utah, in a non-student area, a suburban non-student area. I got a university ethics approval from the University of Otago for all the work I was doing. And I used a selective sample. So my inclusion criteria were that participants be female, married, endowed for at least 2 years for greater familiarity with the church and the practices. They were less than 35 years old, and they had access to the temple relative from one location to the other that was relatively the same. That they attended the temple regularly, at least once every 2 months, although most of the participants in this study went to the temple more often than that. And to avoid a snowball sampling, I chose to interview everyone that met these criteria within the geographic boundaries of a ward unit. To introduce you to the kinds of conversations I was having, let me walk you through the outline of my interview survey. I started off by asking, what are your favorite things about going to the temple? What do you find challenging about the temple, if anything? Have you noticed any differences in the temple ceremony between women and men? Which is a yes or no question. If so, what do these differences mean to you? So interestingly, I designed this research before the 2019 temple updates. So I didn't anticipate that they would be part of this project, but they became an interesting part of this project. Do you know if people can be sealed in the temple more than once if they remarry? And everyone that I interviewed knew about the policy that a man can be sealed to more than one woman, but not vice versa. So I asked, what does this policy mean for you? How do you explain this to yourself? The story of Adam and Eve is written out in the Bible and in the Pearl of Great Price. How does this story relate to your life? What meaning do you take from the story of Adam and Eve? What do you like best about being a woman in the church? What do you find challenging about being a woman in the church? Does your church membership help you create an equal partnership with your husband? Or does your church membership make it harder to create an equal partnership with your husband? How do you understand the roles of nurturing and presiding? Who decides things in your house? What are your feelings about the priesthood? In particular, how men are ordained to the priesthood and women are not. So how do you understand this? And what does this mean to you? So I was not interested in finding out if women agreed or disagreed with any of these practices. I was more interested in understanding or learning about what meanings the women took from these practices, how they explained them to themselves, and how these meanings were manifest in their lives. I feel that I brought a sensitivity to this project that an outside researcher would have found difficult to achieve. As an insider, I knew which questions were likely to make the participants feel uncomfortable or might seem like a violation. Anthropologists around the world have recognized the respect that should be offered to people in any religion or culture regarding rites and ceremonies that are meant only for the initiated. With such open-ended questions as these, I wasn't sure how much consensus I'd get among the participants. However, I came up with so much solid content and such vivid contrasts with such consensus. It was more than I was expecting. It's also more than will fit into this presentation, so I'm offering you a fraction of the material that I have. I thought I'd start out with these questions. What are your favorite things about being a woman in the church, and about equal partnerships? What do you like best about being a woman in the church? This question gained a very definite consensus among the women in Fiji. They were excited to tell me what they loved about being a woman in the church. And this was the message that they had. The church is ahead of the outside culture in empowering women. And this had 100% saturation, meaning that all the participants mentioned this without any prompting from me. These were the kinds of things they talked about, that women learn to speak up at church, that there are fewer rules for church women, that women and men eat together in the church, and that in the church, women learn how to stand up to domestic violence. So here are a few illustrative quotes that I got. One woman said, "When I go to the village, I cannot be the way I am in the church and talk like I'm one of the chiefs. The way we women are treated in the church is way ahead. The church is really advanced." Another woman, "Even with my own family, my dad, we tried to practice the gospel culture. In fact, my dad would be the last one to eat." Another woman said, "When we had a ward activity when I grew up, it's always the men who were always eating first. Not anymore. The change is really drastic. For me, I attribute it to the mission experience. When we go out, we see, and when we come in, we say, okay, no, this is how it's supposed to be done." Outside, there are certain rules you have to follow, like when you're in the village, you can't wear shorts, you have to wear a skirt or a sarong. For us women, there are certain rules here. You can't laugh so loud. Sometimes I have a weakness of laughing very loud. I feel like for a woman outside, you have a lot of rules you have to follow, but in the church, there aren't as many rules. Going on a date is a no-no in the Fijian culture, but in young women's, as young as you are, 15, 14? Young women's is encouraging you to go on a group date. So these are just a few of the quotes I could have drawn from. All the women were giving me the same message. They were proud of the church, how it encouraged them to speak out, to use their voice, to make their own decisions about their haircuts, about the clothes they wore, about how they interacted in public and with the opposite gender. Another theme that came up with a lot of these women was about how their church membership helped them understand how to speak up against domestic violence. So, for example, one woman said, "There are times I say things out loud without even thinking. If I were married to somebody else, meaning outside the church, I would have got a slap like a normal Fijian." Another woman told me quite a dramatic story about hearing a woman close to her home being beaten, And she said that she heard the people, she heard the commotion, and she ran. And because of the culture, it stops women here from intervening, from going in and saving the woman. Because of the gospel in me, I overstep the culture that I have. I ran into the house and just climbed on the abuser. Stop it. So she attributed the courage and the understanding she had to intervene in this situation to her ability to overstep the culture that she had because of the gospel. Another woman told me a similar story about marrying into a home where she was the only member of the church. And her father-in-law, this is what she said, there were many times that my mother-in-law did a couple of things, but then it was violence. There were times she got beaten by my father-in-law in front of me. But the church teaches me to be an independent woman. She said, I was coming back from the temple that day, and the Spirit just tells me, enough is enough. It's about time that someone tells him that what he's doing is wrong. Today will be the last day that you ever abuse my mother-in-law in front of me. I actually said those words.